Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Please respond to the question in the chat box. Please respond to the opening question in the chat box. Please note that today's call is being recorded. Before we begin, we have a few housekeeping items. Today, you will hear from our speakers about the InDEEP Closing the Gap body of research, and then we'll take some questions. Except for the speakers, all participants' lines are muted. During the presentation, you may enter a question at any time simply by typing in the chat box on your screen and then clicking the send button. We will save time near the end to respond to questions sent during the presentation along with others that are submitted during the Q&A portion. I will now turn it over to Jasmine Hall Ratliff, Deputy Director of Keisha Harris and Associates.
Thanks, Tahani, and good afternoon or morning, wherever you're based. I wanted to take a moment to ensure that folks who are joining in have a minute or two to post their responses to the opening question. And as I go through our introductions, we'll take a moment afterwards to just take a look at some of the responses. So first of all, we want to welcome you all to our webinar about the InDEEP Closing the Gap research study. We're delighted that you've joined us, and we hope that what you learned today will aid you in advancing toward a more equitable funding environment for climate and conservation organizations led by Black, Indigenous, people of color communities most impacted by the environmental crisis. I'm joined today by my colleagues Ben Davis, Joel Espino, Michaela Sherrod, and Tyrabia Womble. Ben is the Director of Campaigns for When Collective, where he describes himself as a native Coloradoan, a recovering political consultant, a father and husband, a rock climber, mountain biker, and devout believer in live music. At the When Collective, he works with an incredible team of partners to deliver on greater sustainability in urban environments, support for high-quality journalism, political action on climate change, and many more public endeavors. Joel Espino is a social justice lawyer with experience working on advocacy, strategy, and research to leverage electric transportation and mobility policy as tools for racial justice. Joel co-leads the Clean Transportation Equity Program at When Collective. The program aims to address interconnected injustices by growing social justice capacity and power with the aim of shifting transportation systems toward more justice, inclusion, and sustainability. Michaela Sherrod and Tyrabia Womble are Strategy, Evaluation, and Learning Associates here at Keisha Harris and Associates, Inc., and represent the InDEEP Closing the Gap research team. I'd also like to recognize someone who isn't here with us today. Mrs. Carmen Simon led this body of research over the past several months, and she is currently on maternity leave, and we wish her the best. Ben, Joel, Michaela, and Tyrabia, it is a pleasure to be with you here today. So I'd like to begin by inviting our participants to respond to the following polling questions, and Tahani will put it up on the screen. The first question, we'd like you to range in response to agree to disagree. My organization's board and staff recognize environmental philanthropy's disproportionate funding of white-led organizations as compared to BIPOC-led organizations. And we'll give folks a moment to respond to the first one. And as you're thinking about that and responding, the second question is which option best describes how your organization learns about and openly communicates with BIPOC-led organizations? So let's give folks a moment, and Tahani, when it looks like we have a good set of responses, we can show the results. Tahani, how's it looking? All right. So from the first one, most of the folks in attendance today agree that there is some recognition at the board and staff levels of philanthropy's disproportionate funding of white-led organizations, and thank you to those who responded. And then secondly, the majority again of folks have noted that they are seeking out BIPOC-led organizations whose mission, vision, and values align with our programmatic goals. So thank you to those who did respond. I also see a slightly smaller portion of folks who are saying that their website has clear directions on how to contact them. So thank you for that. And I do also want to share thanks to Robert, who posted a response to the Please Do Now question that you're feeling cautiously optimistic with some concern about interest in racial justice fading. So thank you, Robert. Okay, so a little bit into the goal for our webinar today. Our goal today is to present the issues and strategies that BIPOC-led organizations see as pivotal to climate change mitigation and climate resilience, environmental justice, and conservation. We also share which practices, policies, and priorities are influencing funding to BIPOC-led organizations. BIPOC majority communities experience climate change and its harmful effects to a greater degree than other communities in the United States. Along with land use decisions that are detrimental to BIPOC communities, this knowledge is the basis of the modern environmental justice movement. What is not as readily evident or celebrated is how effectively BIPOC communities and organizations within these communities address climate change. The InDEEP Closing the Gap research focuses on highlighting the issues identified by BIPOC-led organizations as most relevant or challenging, the strategies used to address those issues, and the systemic change generated using those strategies. It also reviews the misalignment or alignment of those strategies with the strategies that are primarily funded by major environmental funders. Finally, the Closing the Gap research examines measures used to track the progress towards mitigating climate change equitably, and makes sense for the necessity of justice and equity-oriented measures to completely understand the impact. I will now turn the mic over to my colleague, Michaela.
Thank you, Jasmine. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. So it's great to be here with you today. As a part of this conversation, what we want to do is to start off with by showing half of a video about Uniontown, Alabama, and this will help set the context for this conversation by allowing frontline community of color to speak for themselves about their experience with environmental issues. And you get a sense for how they advocate and how they're standing up to speak for themselves and for their rights for equitable solutions for environmental justice. So I am going to show that video now. Just a moment.
Uniontown, Alabama is a quiet town in the heart of America's Black Belt. And residents say they are being poisoned by the very air they breathe, the water they drink, and the lives they are trying to live.
We're not breathing the same air. We are breathing hazardous air, harmful air. We shouldn't have to suffer this way.
Situated just miles from a key marker of the civil rights movement, residents say they are now facing a different form of racism, environmental injustice.
Uniontown is so engulfed in love, so much love that it is painful. It is painful because of what's happening there.
The population of Uniontown is almost 90% Black and has a per capita income of just $10,934. And they say that's the reason they have been fighting battles against a local dump accepting coal ash and an antiquated sewage system with little help from local or state government for years.
So they said you were free in this world, but it seemed like some of the things that are done to us are still blacks, and people live in poverty is still modal, it's just environmental racism.
I mean, everything that goes around here is a civil rights issue. I mean, anything from the lagoon to the landfill, the cemetery, everything. It's a civil rights issue.
Now, this joined Senator Cory Booker on a fact-finding mission to Uniontown. We spoke to residents and activists about life in the area. This is their story.
There are graves all across this. This is a historical graveyard that was given in 1858 to the blacks.
Arrowhead Landfill opened in Uniontown in 2007. Today, a mountain of trash from across the U.S. overlooks a historically black cemetery.
Yeah, they made a big wide road. You see how them used to be trees, and they made it right through there. And my dad said this is where the graves is. It's graves all down that line, because a lot of the graves don't have headstones.
Green Group Holdings now owns Arrowhead Landfill, and while they don't own the cemetery property, in 2016, they pledged to work with the community to preserve it.
They're supposed to be maintaining this. They said, well, we'll maintain this cemetery. We said, the people said, okay.
But have they maintained the cemetery?
Look at it. They bumped it and we said, okay, that was a mistake. Then later on, oh, they own this place. I said, how can you own my people? These are where my peoples are. Well, we own it.
How do you feel about it?
How I feel that is wrong, the lack of respect, and I feel like that's the landfill right there, and you don't care enough about my ancestors because I love my community, and you do this.
More than just disrespect, residents say the landfill has brought even bigger, more immediate challenges to their health.
So on top of all the garbage from 30 states that's being brought into your community, you also have 4 million tons of coal ash.
Yeah.
The story behind Uniontown's problems with coal ash began a few states over. In 2008, a dike in Harriman, Tennessee containing coal ash ruptured. The spill released 5.4 million cubic yards of coal ash into the surrounding area. The coal ash waste, which contains materials like mercury, cadmium, and arsenic, made a trip of over 300 miles to the landfill in Uniontown.
Taking that from a white area, the white people didn't want it. Let's just keep it 100. If the white folks ain't want it, why do you think it's good enough for the blacks?
Harriman, Tennessee is almost 90% white. Uniontown, Alabama is almost 90% black. Even with materials like mercury, cadmium, and arsenic in coal ash, the EPA does not classify coal ash as hazardous material, which frustrates and concerns Uniontown residents.
We have a lot of question marks, and we have a lot of our everyday fear because, you know, you're wondering, EPA said it's not hazardous, and you're just wondering, is it hazardous, is it not? But your everyday life is fear. Fear of something somebody else didn't want comes to your area.
My family lives on that road on my mom's side. My Uncle Sonny passed away, and I can remember this. He told me, he said, baby, I didn't get sick until they moved that coal ash in there.
You know, just talking about coal ash, what did you take out of coal ash to not make it hazardous?
If 10 people in a 5-mile radius are all dying from kidney failure, there is something going on in that particular area that is far greater than them just being old and sick. That a lot of people feel, especially that lived around there, that it was a hazard to their health. And to this day, I do believe my Uncle Sonny when he said, when they came in, it made them sick.
The landfill has said they are disposing of coal ash safely and responsibly, and has sued 4 Uniontown residents for defamation for describing their experience living near the landfill. The $30 million lawsuit has since been dropped, but clearly, problems remain.
Yeah, because right over here by this tree, do you want to walk over there? I can show you an old headstone.
I'm sure, I'd love to see it.
Okay. They keep moving it for some reason.
So this, we don't even know what this is marking.
They put it back here. It wasn't here. Many times we walked out here, and it said Rebecca Davis, born February 25th.
You can see it's just been cast here. This has not been sitting here for a long time.
No, 1882, and died February 25th, 1925. It's just a lack of respect, you know what I'm saying? And then by me being black, I just can't. I can't hate though, because I have to keep my eyes on what I'm looking for. I'm looking for justice.
On the other
Michaela, you're on mute.
Yep, just realized that. Gotta hate when that happens. All right, so thank you all for watching that. We wanted to just use this just to sort of cue up this whole conversation, to tee it up, just to show the importance of education and advocacy, which are hallmarks of the environmental justice movement. And this is a really great segue into the research on closing the gap. So the purposes of closing the gap research were to cull pre-existing research that documents the efficacy of cross-movement efforts, which is organizational work that weaves conservation and environmental issues across themes such as civic participation, early childhood education, and economic development. It will also substantiate the leadership of BIPOC-focused organizations over the past 40 years, build on prior research to catalyze the use of data in accelerating funder learning, and provide focused, context-specific justice and equity-oriented indicators for progress. So just a little bit of background. So through interviews of key BIPOC thought leaders and a review of scholarly literature, this research will inform a curriculum for and assessment of a learning journey for funders. It'll contribute to the background for an interdependent and cross-movement convening of environmental grant makers, and broadly provide evidence supportive of funding BIPOC-led climate change organizations. The argument for funding BIPOC-led organizations will be supported by a quantification of a funding gap between white-led climate organizations and BIPOC-led climate organizations. This argument is also supported by the description of the disconnected strategies that are currently funded and other strategies that are highly effective but not yet funded, and the necessary link between traditional technocratic measures and justice and equity-oriented measures. So this research will be shared with the field to further an understanding of how organizational work that weaves conservation and environmental issues across cross-movement work, as I previously mentioned, all of the different areas. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what you see on the screen here is just representative of a comment that just shows that some of the traditional focuses of conservation and environmental funders that when you look at environmental justice communities, that for them it's so much more basically about living in the quality of life that they don't have the opportunity to that they can't focus on other things. So this quote is looking at polar bears, and and one of the interviewees commented that she heard that the polar bears were going to disappear, and then she says, I mean, who cares? Let's be real. Have you seen a polar bear? Nobody cares. And so this is just depictive. It just shows just sort of the disconnect. So I'll go on and I'll talk a little bit about the methodology. So we used a two-pronged approach: interviews and a gap data analysis. Next slide, please. So the interviews were divided into three sections: BIPOC-led organization focus, funder focus, justice and equity indicators. So we interviewed 30 people, 2 were funders, 3 scholars, and 25 were BIPOC leaders. Next slide, please. Okay, those who were interested in being interviewed, both funders and BIPOC leaders, mostly worked in environmental justice with an N of 31 and climate justice with an N of 29. So as you can see in the graphic, just the categories, the environmental subfields, there is one category listed as other, and it includes some subfields such as anti-water privatization, anti-oppression, biocultural diversity, disasters, evaluation, environmental education and outreach, eco-village and eco-village development, just to name a few. There are several others, and we do have a list that could be shared. So none of the prospective interviewees worked within marine and ocean conservation, environmental archaeology, or aquaculture and fisheries. Next slide, please. So in this slide and subsequent slides, I will be referencing a few data points presented in the two-pager that was sent to you prior to this webinar. KHA licensed data from Candid and conducted the analysis. In our data sample, we identified 13,959 environmental and conservation grants that were associated with 954 organizations. To be included in the sample, the environmental and conservation grants had to be a minimum of $25,000 and received between 2014 and 2018. And it also had to be associated with reported demographic information of the race of the organization's leader. Next slide, please. So what is the funding gap? So despite the small sample of organizations that reported demographic information to Candid and that received a minimum grant of $25,000, our gap analysis confirms that white-led organizations are more resourced and better funded than BIPOC-led organizations. The funding gap between white-led organizations and BIPOC-led organizations is approximately $2.7 billion. Although BIPOC-led organizations were awarded grants for a longer duration, that difference being 1 month, white-led organizations were awarded 75.8% more grants than BIPOC-led organizations. Next slide, please. White-led organizations received 78.2% more grants at the $25,000 level. So in this calculation, white-led organizations received 75.4% more grants above the $25,000 grant level than BIPOC organizations. The difference in the maximum grant amount received by white-led organizations and BIPOC-led organizations is approximately $11.2 million. Now, I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, Tyrabia, who will lead you through a review of the key findings of this research study and the implications for funding practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. And in my section, as Michaela mentioned, I'll provide an overview of some of the key findings from the interviews conducted with BIPOC leaders and funders. And these key findings will highlight some issues and strategies that BIPOC-led organizations see as pivotal to positively influencing the mitigation of climate change, climate resilience, environmental justice, food systems, and conservation. And we will also highlight some of the practices, policies, and priorities influencing funding to BIPOC-led organizations. So on the next slide, the next slide after this one, thank you. This highlights what we found as the most salient strategies that BIPOC leaders were using to generate systemic change within climate change mitigation, climate resilience, environmental justice, food systems, and conservation. So the main 3 strategies that BIPOC leaders use to generate systemic change within policy, funder focus, community awareness, and personal sustainability efforts within these 5 different topical areas were massive community organizing, advocacy, and mass education. Funders and BIPOC leaders viewed the role of BIPOC-led priorities as being categorized by a commitment to offsetting the devastating impacts climate change and environmental issues have on BIPOC communities, and to ensuring BIPOC futures within each of these 5 different topical areas. One thing that I wanted to note and highlight was that it was very difficult for funders and BIPOC leaders to identify specific strategies used in BIPOC-led work to generate systemic change within the field of conservation. And upon further probing, many BIPOC leaders noted that conservation is one of the most discriminatory fields in practice and theory. One BIPOC leader expressed her difficulty in figuring out ways BIPOC leaders have generated systemic change within conservation because of the traditional lens and characteristics of the field that are exclusive of BIPOC communities. So this BIPOC leader mentioned, and this is her direct quote, "Unfortunately, in the traditional sense, with conservation, you're conserving something that's still intact. With BIPOC communities, there's not really much nature still intact to conserve. So conservation in these communities deals more with the restoration or regeneration of things. So something like urban farms or taking a vacant lot and regenerating it. And so in this case, you're not conserving very much based on the ideas of traditional conservation. Additionally, it was found that BIPOC leaders and communities practice conservation by preserving, reserving, and protecting history and culture and restoring historical property. And so some of the examples that the BIPOC leaders gave was like accruing land and buying land to use it as green spaces and preserving slave burial grounds or creating community gardens. And so staying on this slide, we also asked BIPOC leaders about, go back to the previous slide, please. Yes. So we also asked BIPOC leaders about some of the issues that the organizations see as pivotal to positively influencing each of these 5 different domains. And so generally what we found was that BIPOC leaders mentioned the strategy of mass education as a pivotal one to promoting individual sustainable habits and to reframing the ways in which BIPOC communities relate within each of these areas. So as depicted in this graphic, the top 2 strategies pivotal to impacting these 5 different topical areas were education, advocacy and awareness, and the second one, research and evaluation. Funders and BIPOC leaders alike named the following examples as ways to improve education, advocacy, and awareness. The first example was increasing foundational knowledge of personal sustainability habits. And so some more specific examples were teaching communities how to grow food in a continuously changing climate based on their location. The second example was raising awareness of and creating tailored education programs to mitigate environmental issues by communities in a place-based context. And lastly was mobilizing communities, leaders, and governments to address environmental issues. And when it came to research and evaluation, an example provided by BIPOC leaders and funders as a way to impact environmental conservation issues was engaging in participatory methods to positively impact environmental issues. And so a term that was used to describe this participatory method was community science. And that was a term that resonated with a few of the BIPOC leaders we interviewed, and they used it to describe it as one of their leading research and evaluation strategies to empower and give autonomy to communities. The next slide will cover practices, policies, and priorities influencing funding to BIPOC-led organizations. So when we asked BIPOC leaders about some of their enabling strategies that they've observed to influence funding to BIPOC-led organizations, the following were given as examples. So the first one was collaborative working opportunities and funding models, using an intergenerational community-oriented approach as a strategy to address environmental and conservation concerns, providing more funding for research, and streamlining grant application processes. Something that came up in this set of questions was BIPOC leaders noting that funders perceive BIPOC-led organizations to lack organizational capacity necessary to carry out grant requirements, and that was seen as a huge deterrent to influence and funding to BIPOC-led organizations. And this sentiment is archived in historic InDEEP data where perceptions of organizational capacity, funder inflexibility, and just trust have been reported as contributing factors to the observed disparities faced by BIPOC leaders and organizations in access to funding and other resources, as well as relationship and partnership development. Funders who were interviewed for this research project reported that funding community is focused on incorporating racial justice and equity into organizational frameworks to create inclusive spaces within grant making, and also to help revise regional grant making strategies. And they are also investing more in community-driven programs, as in all these are strategies to influence funding towards BIPOC-led organizations. A few funders noted that an increased focus on racial justice and equity that we see now as a trend is attributed to the most recent demonstrations of anti-Blackness as the main influence. Additional strategies provided by funders were staffing community organizers within their organizations to aid in their organizational learning about what is happening on the ground and how BIPOC leaders are being involved, utilizing grantee networks to learn more about local BIPOC-led efforts, and creating a trustee body of philanthropic practitioners and grantees. And next, I'm going to review some of the implications for practice of this body of research. So all of these key findings and the results from the interviews with funders and BIPOC leaders have implications that are generally applicable to conservation and environmental funders. And so these implications for practice involve acknowledging and understanding race as it relates to experiences with climate change and expanding understanding and strategies to rethink relationships, funding practices, and progress in the field so that it is more inclusive. In terms of the first implication, to acknowledge race, philanthropic organizations seek to solve problems impacting humankind. And one of the things that is a truth, a universal truth that we know, is that historically philanthropy has attempted to resolve societal issues without much regard to how race impacts the severity of these issues. And while race is more of a construct than a scientific fact, in a US context, it's almost impossible to divorce most societal issues from race. So research has also shown that even when controlling for other factors like gender, geography, education, and socioeconomic standing, race is still a determinant of outcomes. So a philanthropic organization cannot hope to address the societal ill without acknowledging the impact of race on the outcomes associated with that societal ill. Also, in addition to that, just giving more of a specific example from the importance of acknowledging race that comes from the interviews is this idea that one BIPOC leader mentioned, that the colonial underpinnings of the field are very much still dominating funding culture as related to philanthropy strategies. And these underpinnings cause funders to ignore that conservation is about preserving what still exists. And so conversely, often in BIPOC communities, the goal is to regenerate what has been damaged. And so the implication is that if a philanthropic organization funds conservation, that organization must acknowledge the role of race in the history and current strategies of the field. The second one, about understanding how climate change's human impacts vary by race, comes from a lot of research showing that how the increase in green gas concentrations, global temperatures, sea levels, and historical flooding are impacting large parts of the world where BIPOC people inhabit. And so therefore, BIPOC people primarily who live in warmer climates are moving to more habitable and workable areas, contributing to a growing population of climate refugees. And as climate changes increasingly contributes to ecological collapse and resource scarcity, BIPOC people face a greater uncertainty in relocating and adapting. And when it comes to increasing equitable grant making, this is something that funders should also take into account. Expanding understanding of issues and strategies that will work is based off a question that we asked BIPOC leaders in the interviews. And the question was asking them about systemic change and how it's generated by BIPOC-led organizations. And so interviewees noted that BIPOC-led organizations generate change within policy, funder focus, community awareness, and personal sustainability efforts. And so the primary strategies used have been massive community organizing, mobilization of communities through advocacy, and mass education about the issues. These lists of issues and strategies were noted to be pivotal to influencing climate change, climate resilience, environmental justice, food systems, and conservation. They are the issues that impact people's everyday lives, and in order for funders to be able to adequately address these issues, they have to expand their ideas of what traditional strategies are to incorporate the individual lives that people lead. And in rethinking relationships, this implication emerged from the common practice of closed solicitations in the field. So interviewees, both BIPOC leaders and funders, noted how much of a deterrent that closed solicitations are to entry. Funders must continue to rethink how they build relationships with potential grantees and then use those relationships. So as an example, a program officer can have a variety of touch points within the organization's executive director and can gain rapport and trust. However, because much of the United States still lives, worships, and plays in largely racially homogenous settings, the likelihood of a BIPOC executive director developing a personal relationship with a program officer in environmental philanthropy's largely white ranks are low. So if a relationship is to continue to play a large role in getting into the door, funders must rethink current relationships and mechanisms used to initiate and maintain communication with potential grantees. And lastly, rethinking funding practices. Interviewees noted that improved funding tactics are a hallmark of trust-based philanthropy. And so funder and BIPOC leader interviewees stressed the importance of streamlined, transparent, and simplified paperwork. So this body of research makes clear that funders should be intentional about each bit of information requested and have a known purpose for collecting that information. Additionally, BIPOC leaders noted the lack of response when submitting a proposal as a deterrent for continuing to seek funding. When asked about reasons provided for not funding a proposal, BIPOC leaders noted that in the rare case, a reason is actually given to them and is generally a stock response about the number of excellent proposals that they have received. More often than not, no response was provided at all. And so this makes it impossible for grantees to understand what could be attractive for funders. And so the idea is that when funders model transparency, power, awareness, and vulnerability, it signals the grantees that they can show up more fully. And lastly, when it comes to rethinking progress, one of the primary goals of this research, as Kyla mentioned, was to identify a set of equity or justice-oriented indicators of progress within the field of climate change mitigation. Interviewees, both those who are BIPOC leaders and those who are funders, were asked to describe the indicators they use and also provide criteria or descriptors of these indicators as a whole. These indicators are not intended to replace traditional measures of climate change mitigation, but to help users understand how much movement in health, housing, education, and income indicators is related to climate change. An underlying statement or sentiment was that the most significant social justice indicators would be achieved once these intersectional pain points and gaps involving health, education, and housing income start to close. And I will read a comment from a BIPOC funder that says, I think we really need to be talking about climate finance and how we can eliminate all of the racially connected problems that emanate economic, environmental, social health, and use that money to address all those things at the neighborhood level and at the regional level. And she goes on to mention about there being trillions of dollars involved in energy retrofits, renewable energy, and other economic pathways that can help correct the economic underpinning. And at the end of the quote, she stresses that we, funders, have to tie these intersectional pain points to climate work and also to economic strategies. Now I'm going to turn the mic back over to Jasmine to lead us into a discussion about the findings.
Thank you, Tarabia, and this is all exciting and fascinating and really interesting results of the project. And thank you also to Michaela for being a part of the research and the presentation. So now I'd like to pose a few questions to Joel and Ben as our panelists. And as Ben and Joel are ruminating on their responses and contributing to the conversation, we would love for folks to put their questions in the chat so that we can go to those near the end of the session. So first, Joel, this is for you to start with. Please share with us your initial reactions to the data presented today. I'd like to hear if any of the data resonated with you, surprised you, or validated what you've heard and considered.
Yeah, I just kind of want to start by just saying thanks and shout out to you all, Tarabia, Michaela, Carmen, for all the work that you put into this research and for the presentation. So I just wanted to kind of start there. As I think about this question, Audre Lorde's powerful quote comes to mind, and I'm sure we've all heard it many times, and I always go back to it, which is, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? And so I think about this quote because it kind of gives me a useful frame and analysis to put this data into context, right? What that quote essentially is telling me is that the current dominant culture, the master's house, if you will, is rooted in white supremacy, and we know this. And so then what that allows me to do is better understand how, the master's house operates, what it looks like, and what its kind of main character traits are. And so in turn, what that does is just gives me clarity and information to be a better agent of change. And so the reason why I start there with that quote is because essentially what this data does, as I heard it and I felt it, was that it affirms my understanding of how the world works. And that is that in America, there is a racial hierarchy that is embedded in every aspect of life and society, right? And so because of that, it will almost always be the case that white folks benefit more, and the rest of us will benefit least and be hardest hit by the burdens and the quote negative externalities of our society. And so what this data also does is that it affirms my personal lived experience, being a former grantee in the nonprofit industrial complex, if you will, where I saw, the big dollars, time and again go to, white-led green groups, and the rest of us were left fighting for scraps, right? And so, my personal, along with my personal experience too, I come to the realization that, one of the ways to get bigger dollars from funders was to have, a big green group validate our work. And that worked for us back when I was at the Green Lining Institute, right? We were in part of a coalition where NRDC was one of the members, and NRDC, we co-fundraise with NRDC, and having NRDC as a validator gave us, bigger access to bigger dollars. And by the way, this dynamic that we're talking about that I'm just unpacking in my, personal lived experience, sometimes the way that played out, unfortunately, it led to, dynamics and politics of scarcity among POC-led groups. And so what we know around that is that it just creates unhealthy dynamics within an ecosystem that increasingly we know needs to be more diverse, inclusive, and cohesive and collaborative. So these dynamics just further drive a wedge in this kind of future movement that we need. And then the last thing I'll say is that, what this data allows me to do is that it gives me a tool, right, to shift the culture and the system of climate philanthropy. Because, what I know and what we know is that on an unconscious level, right, the dominant culture will trust the data before it trusts, the words of people of color. And so having this data is just another tool in the toolbox to further shift culture. So that's what I got to say on that question. Thank you.
Thanks, Hillel. How about you, Ben?
Well, first I would double click, as Hillel likes to say, on everything he just said. I couldn't agree more. For me, the quote about polar bears and the immediacy of environmental injustice versus how the climate movement has largely talked about the climate fight over the last 10 to 20 years, I think is also really relevant. And I think when you look at the climate movement over the last 2 decades, it's been a technically difficult space to enter. It's mainly been the funding has mainly gone towards the big green groups and other partners in the business community that they felt were movable. And it hasn't been a diverse movement that's been inclusive of all Americans. And so I think when I look at these numbers, which is, for me, it's a clear call to action that if we want a movement that includes all of us to help solve a problem that's impacting all of us in a wide variety of ways, we simply have to change our approach. And the same patient capital that grew NRDC and Environmental Defense Fund and many of the other names that we all recognize at the state and national level, that same patient investment needs to happen yesterday to grow organizations that represent more diverse communities, more heavily impacted communities, so that as we start to identify solutions, they're not regressive solutions. And they help build us as a collective towards solving these really major problems that we're facing in the environmental space.
Thanks, Ben. And for both of you, first of all, Joel, I love the quote. You may have to put that in chat for us to take and use elsewhere. But a lot of great points about just, affirming your experience, both of you really, Ben, from your perspective. And also, I love the concept that, taking that data is something that, we often understand, as Joel, you mentioned, that the dominant culture will trust the data as a sector and across many sectors. The experience and the qualitative and the storytelling is something that still needs to be moved into culture so that folks believe the stories in addition to, and maybe in some cases above the data. But starting with data is definitely helpful. And, there's a saying, and I'm probably going to butcher, but something to the effect of what doesn't get measured doesn't happen. And I think also, what doesn't get measured doesn't also prompt change. So having this data in front of us, then, as you mentioned, will hopefully help to prompt change because it's in so-called black and white of folks seeing truly where the money is going and thinking a little bit more deeply about their funding practices and changing them, essentially. So our next question, and whoever wants to start can jump on it. When you think about your organization's climate and or conservation portfolio, to what degree have you relied on your relationships with big green groups to inform your planning and grant-making activities?
I'm happy to start with that. Joel and I both work in the WEND Collective, and over the last 5 years, our organization has developed greater staffing and internal expertise in terms of how we do our grant making in the climate justice space. For our early years, though, we're largely informed by partners and consultants. And, I'll speak from my experience. You gravitate to who you've worked with over your career. And over my 20-year career, I've worked with a lot of the big green groups, both here in Colorado and elsewhere. And so very naturally, our funding flowed to those groups. And it's because our original orientation was very much, how can we be a productive partner in solving the climate problem? And so when you think about it from that lens, how do we drive impact? How quickly can we drive impact? And who's primed to do that? Who has access to decision makers, policymakers, who has the resources to drive the change that we'd like to fund? You very quickly end up with the same groups that have been built to be in that position. In the intervening years since that moment, we actually recognized that equity and justice, this is 4 or 5 years ago, would be a core component of everything we do moving forward. The second you make that decision, your priorities change, your partnerships change, and the way your dollars flow change. And so as for us, that meant identifying partners that could be grown or are already in a position to represent a more diverse perspective on climate injustice and environmental injustice. And so very quickly, our partnerships and our grant making shifted as well. And I think that speaks to what this data shows, which is depending on where you put your priorities, is it immediate impact or is it building a more inclusive movement? Is it investing in more people or is it investing in the same solutions we've been investing in over 20 years? You very quickly change what success looks like. And if it's a little less metrics driven and far more focused on investing in people and the role that people can play in solving these problems, it becomes an imperative to adjust your approach.
Thanks. Joel, how about you?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to what Ben said is, we're less reliant on big groups in planning moving forward. And I think part of it has to do, and I'm borrowing this from our friends over at Equation Campaign, where they say, if we take stock of all that we have, like, our resources, the science, the money. We have what we need to make huge shifts in support of climate change, or in support of climate action. What we don't have is the power to realize it and to leverage all of that towards that change. And so ultimately, where I land and where we're landing with our strategy is that historically, the environmental movement, the climate movement hasn't had a good power analysis, right? It's been very technocratic. It's been very kind of insider gamey. And what we know about sort of the political power shifts that we're experiencing in this country is that increasingly the pathway forward is investing in justice-focused multiracial coalitions, right? And the way through that, or the way to get there, is to follow those closest to the pain, follow folks of color, communities of color that are experiencing the pain the most, and do the work around power building and grassroots building that Tyrabia and others touched on, right, in terms of the findings. And so for us, if you have that analysis of how change happens, right, because ultimately what we know is that to really mitigate the impacts of climate change, we need to move fast, and we need to move big, and we just don't have the power to do that. So what are we doing right now in the here and now to develop that power to get to those big, ambitious, bold climate actions that we need? So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, no, thanks to both of you. And I want to pick up a whole on what you just said about power analysis in the sector. This is something that in my former life at a foundation, when we were funding advocacy work in other spaces, something we often talked about was working with communities to do power analyses to help them understand who holds the power and who needs to be brought into the conversation. And so doing that in this sector is something that I agree with is very much needed. And then also, Ben, your mention on how focusing on racial equity made you all completely change your perspective and your partners and where you're funding. That is definitely a mindset shift that occurs when you realize that focusing on communities that are most impacted means you have to fund differently, and you have to find different organizations and not the ones that you're used to working with on a regular basis. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So we have our final question for the two of you, and I want folks to continue to post in the chat. We have a couple good ones already in there, and so we'll get to those after this final question. What role or roles can funders play in influencing equitable policies that regulate the actions taken by corporations to alleviate the burden that's been experienced in BIPOC communities? And Joel, I'll start with you.
Yeah, this is a juicy question. And yeah, the way that I've kind of wrapped my head around this question is, I think I want to start by getting clear about what are the tools at the funder's disposal, right? And how can we wield those tools in service of communities of color? And so the way that I'm making sense of how funders can also create impact is, the traditional way, which is our grant making practices, right? So what are funders doing to generate and sustain ground up community power, like we talked about? What are we doing to incorporate the implications for practice that Tyrabia talked about, right? In terms of how we fund, how long we fund, our reporting, the relationships that we are doing. So that's obviously the natural way that funders can sort of what they can do to be in service of communities of color. The second thing that I think about is, depending on who the funder is, the foundation, the influence that they hold, is wielding that influence and power directly to advocate directly to corporations, right? What is the CEO? What are the board doing in terms of writing letters or hiring lobbyists to engage with corporations and federal regulators or state regulators to continue to hold corporations accountable? So what are foundations doing kind of more directly as direct advocates in this fight, right? What are the press conferences that they're announcing? What are the pledges and initiatives they are creating? So I think about that as another tool, if you will, that the funder can leverage. And the last thing I think about, and Edgar Villanueva talks about this a lot, is our assets and investments and our endowments that we have. That is an easy way to, we talk about divestment strategies. That is one way to really hit corporations in the pocket, so to speak, right? In terms of really being strategic about how investments are deployed and what are we supporting and what are we not. So I try to think about the whole of the funder and the foundation in particular, and really try to think creatively about what are the different levers that we can pull in service of community. So that's just some thoughts there.
Yeah, I agree.
Ben, how about you?
I think looking at the levers that we have available to us, both as foundations or family offices, and then also as advocates, is really key. I really agree with what Joel just framed up. It's a privilege to be in the room when policies are made. It's an extreme privilege. It's a privilege that leads to the way that those policies are designed, the folks that they have in mind when they're implemented or don't have in mind, and then the way that starts to build a bad foundation upon which we continue to layer more and more policy updates or changes. And the way in which we're trying to tackle the climate fight eventually leads us to pricing consumption differently than we do today, whether that's energy or products or both. The second we start pricing things based on impact instead of affordability is the second we start to leave people out of the solution. And so to me, the only way to prevent that is to change who's in the room as quickly as we possibly can, because otherwise those policies are going to hurt the people who can afford it the least. And so when I think about all the policy change rooms I've been in as an advocate, as a lobbyist, and as a consultant, the rooms look just like me. And the policies that were designed had me in mind. We have to change that. And the best way we can do that today as funders and as advocates is to push every single day to change who has access to those discussions and who's viewed as a valid person to be sitting at that table. And I would argue that's as urgent a call to action as reducing carbon. Otherwise, we're going to reduce it in ways that hurt the same people we're trying to help.
Yeah. No, thanks to both of you for that. I think what I'm taking away from your responses to this question particularly is, changing who's in the room. I mean, that's a really big issue, not just at the community level, but also in the advocacy space. Who can you bring in front of policymakers that are closest to the problem, and using your influence and your connections and your relationships with various power brokers, if you will, the power brokers, I'm sorry, whether it's corporations, policymakers, those who are making decisions, bringing your grantees and partners into those rooms so that they can hear directly from them as opposed to, seeing your faces all the time. That's a big key takeaway that I think a lot of folks forget. Foundations have that kind of power. Foundations have much more than money. They have influence. They have other resources that's beyond the dollar that could be utilized in these cases. So we have a couple of questions in the chat. I want to transition into those who have posted questions. And again, please feel free to continue posting. We'll start with, there were a couple of questions around the grant size that was utilized in the study. And Tyravia did respond in the chat about $25,000 being a substantial amount of received funding. And so that's why that money was used as the baseline for the research. But please feel free to ask any other questions you have about the data itself. Let me move to first Melvin's question. It's safe to say in these last few months, we're seeing an increased push and emphasis on funding directly to POC-led or diverse organizations. But is this just an ephemeral trend, or is it long lasting? And what can we do to ensure that there's increased access and funding to these diverse organizations in the long term? And I'll let either one of you start with that.
Joel's not taking himself off mute, so I'll jump in. I'm cautiously optimistic that this is a lasting change. I say that recognizing how often we've been in moments in our country's history where we thought we were at a turning point and it turned out to be less impactful than we'd hoped. I'm really hopeful that's not where we are today. What we're seeing through our relationships with other foundations and peer funders is a dogged interest in being a better partner and investing in more communities to build their impact. What we're also seeing is there's particularly in the larger foundations that are less nimble than ours as a family office, there is a historical bureaucratic pressure to achieve results with the dollars that leave the door. And when you have that pressure, unless you're redefining what success looks like as to growing a movement instead of reducing loads of carbon in the air as the priority, that change is going to be slow to come. So Joel and I are both working with 17 other foundations right now to both identify and understand the disparity in funding that has historically been in place, which these numbers certainly underscore. And then we're working with them to identify how we're going to address this disparity with a long, patient investments over the next decade. So for that reason, I'm hopeful. At the same time, I recognize how many times we've been hopeful in the past.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ben. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add.
I actually missed the question because what you don't see going on over here is a crazy dog barking in the middle of you asking that question. So I can just leave it to what Ben said, or
no worries at all. Well, the question was whether this can be a long-term change when it comes to increasing access and funding to diverse organizations. Are we only reacting to the moment, or what are the ways that can be put into place to make this a lasting sort of cultural shift?
Yeah, I mean, just to respond quickly, I think history repeats itself, right? And I think I was reading an article recently, a couple months ago, where they were doing an analysis, right, of like what happened in the early days of Black Lives Matter and how that kind of generated, again, like this influx of concern and funding and infusion from the philanthropic community for, I don't know, 1-2 years. And then it quickly went back to business as usual, right? Where funders increasingly didn't see, work around Black Lives Matter or criminal justice reform or police brutality as, things to fund. And so, I don't know, history does repeat itself. So like, yeah, there's a big foundational question there about like, how are we learning from the past and what are we doing different moving forward to make sure that that doesn't happen? And we need to be very introspective and very self-aware about what those patterns are. What are those things that continuously continue to loop us back to business as usual? So we need to do the work as people, and in particular, we need to do the work as funders to be very clear about what that is.
Great, thank you.
I will share.
For our second.
I think a little of my optimism just comes from the very intentional nature of the discussions we're now having that weren't happening 2 years ago. Were starting to happen a year ago. And now it's almost, it feels like a requirement to have the discussion at all, is to discuss how we're going to weave justice into the work. I hope that doesn't fade. And I guess that's where I'm feeling optimistic. It's just the way conversations have changed.
Yeah, and if I can just, never mind, I won't further this.
No, go ahead.
What Ben just said, it kind of triggered a thought too, which is like, when I was an advocate, you do see progress, right? People are using the language of equity, and now you're seeing more people use the language of systemic racism and anti-Blackness and white supremacy. But increasingly what happens is those terms get co-opted, right? And they become tokenized, right? And so we need to be careful about, just be careful about that. That's a dynamic that happens with change work, And I think back of another quote, right? I don't know if you all have seen the documentary on Netflix called The 13th. And there's a quote in there that says, systems of oppression are durable and they tend to reinvent themselves, right? So just when we think we got it figured out, it's morphed and turned and adapted into this other thing. And so we need to be on it, right? Because we can quickly be lulled into thinking that change is happening when, if you look under the layers, it's actually not. We just change the wording a little bit to make ourselves feel good.
Which means
as
funders, we're reducing our natural power as having access to resources and controlling what the program looks like, which I think is how you end up with really flat, ineffective definitions of what an equitable and just program looks like.
Yeah. So related to, we're sort of merging and moving into the second question about definitions. How can we expand or get away from the rigid, narrow, and often white-centered definitions to define the work that BIPOC folks are doing to mitigate climate change and community environmental work? And thanks to Grace for asking that.
Howell and I work together a lot, and I'm the chatty one, and so I'm constantly checking myself to not respond first.
So what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm actually trying to read the question back again. So why don't you start, Ben, so I get a better handle on it.
I think I spoke, from my perspective, I spoke to this a little bit earlier. I mean, when I first started really looking at climate as an area of focus for us, it was really technically intimidating. I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientist. I'm a political campaigner who's using those tools to hopefully drive good change in the world. And so I found the climate policy space incredibly intimidating. And so when you think about that and all the reasons why, that space is hard to enter, very quickly, you end up with a space dominated by folks who have the technical expertise capable of sitting there in that room. And then you end up with conversations about carbon and power plants and public utility commissions and all these spaces that are like hard for the folks that are in there now, much less people trying to enter it to drive more just solutions to these problems. So, I think one of the first things we can do is recenter this discussion. That work is important. The work that folks are doing in all aspects of the climate movement is important. I think a role that we need to play and that we can play is one where we work really hard to refocus this on the impacts of today and to connect people more directly with what climate change means right now in this moment, what environmental injustice has meant for the last 50 years, and start this discussion again with, we're all humans, we all deserve the right to lead long, healthy lives, and that shouldn't be defined by where we live or where we grew up. So I guess that's where I tend to go, is let's make this far more accessible for far more people, not just for the advocates, the organizations, but for all the people we're trying to serve that are impacted by this, whether they believe in it or not, which is also a challenge in itself.
Yeah, what I would add is, there's like a reorientation that needs to happen too, right? About defining what success looks like. Ben alluded to this, right? Historically, this field has been kind of very metrics driven in terms of its definitions and what success looks like. And so if we are to fully live into what Tyrabia described to us around implications for practice, we need to be following, right, the leaders and co-creating and not have predetermined definitions of what XYZ is, right? That we either, define things by what those closest to the pain are telling us, or we co-create it together, step or hand in hand with our partners. And so that's one of the ways that Ben and I are trying to kind of shift how we do work, is very much in partnership, in deep co-creation, in following those closest to the pain. And so when you have that orientation, you are less focused on, you know, white definitions, as Grace, you know, put it, and you're being more responsive to what's actually happening and what's actually needed on the ground.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to open my next question up to all the boxes that I see in front of for anyone who wants to answer. And I wanted to ask, what about the data that you just heard was most striking or concerning to you, to any of you? And we'll pay attention to who comes off mute first to try to call on names. Or if you have questions that jump to mind, feel free to put them in the chat also.
Jasmine, we did too well.
Yeah, exactly. It was clear that it was completely clear to everybody. I see one comment that not much of it was surprising and more confirming what folks knew to be true. So I appreciate you, Robert, for that. Are there folks who agree with that and want to make a comment as to anything that just confirmed or reaffirmed what you already were thinking in your work?
Hi, yeah, this is Adriana Quintero at Energy Foundation, and I just want to thank you all. Definitely feels like this data is confirming of everything that we've lived, as Howell put it, and experience in the rooms that I know I've been in, and really just excellent work. And I'm hopeful that the level of detail that's reflected here is going to help to really make it just crystal clear that the path forward is in this direction. And I just love how you've highlighted all of the and predicted the questions that we hear arise over and over as reasons in parentheses for not being where we need to be. So I'm just very grateful. Thank you so much for excellent work.
Thank you, Adriana. Anyone else who wanted to comment on the data, or if anything that Ben and Howell were saying during the question and answer exchange that jumped out at you and you want to speak to?
I see Robert has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Joelle. There was a section earlier on, I forget who was presenting, and I believe it stated something that funders expressed hesitancy to fund BIPOC-led organizations because they had concerns about capacity. And I just wanted to get a little more insight into that, especially the circular logic of not investing in people because they don't have capacity. What specifically did they say that gave them, what kind of capacity did they not have, and did they not believe in their capacity to build capacity? I'd just like to understand that better.
So sure, I'll let either Tyrabia or Michaela take that from a data standpoint, but then also Howell and Ben would be interested in hearing your perspective and talking with your peers in the space.
Yeah, I can take this question. So from the data standpoint and interviews that we've done with BIPOC leaders, they felt that there was this mistrust in the abilities of the organization that was like represented by the lack of multi-year funding. And so their idea and logic was that they don't trust us enough to do this work because they don't give it to us over a certain amount of years. It's kind of like I forget what it is, a grant period basis. And another thing too is that when we talked to some funders, the funder said that she felt like there was also like this bias that BIPOC-led organizations don't have the capacity, whether it be staff or like the sheer scope to like do all the work within the grant applications and to give it back in a manner that would also like accomplish some of the foundation organizational goals.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add on this one, other than, yeah, just affirming that I have seen that and experienced that, right? Of like, I think that kind of happened with the Bezos Earth Fund a little bit too, right? Where part of the hesitancy in funding smaller EJ organizations was the fact that they might not be able to hold and capture the resources, right? They didn't have the capacity for more capacity and resources. So there's something there about just like a frame of thinking that needs to shift, because it is a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're talking about.
Yeah, and there's also this internal pressure to accomplish things, show you made a change by distributing wealth. And if you're not showing that, you're not managing wealth very well, which immediately runs into a space of white supremacy and the total privilege it is to say, we're only going to do it if we can truly solve the problem, which is all head and no heart. And so what our message to our peers has been, you don't have to walk away from the head at all, and you don't have to walk away from those driving those impacts. At the same time, invest in people too. Like it's not a binary choice. You can invest in people and you can lower that expectation, and then you start to feel really comfortable. Success looks like building capacity, growing organizations, flooding the field with a whole new set of advocates and people who are empowered to do that. Like that to me is a big deal. And I think that's what drives that circular logic. Well, I can't give to that group because they're not positioned to get the mission accomplished. It's like, well, yeah, they'll stay that way until you change what the mission is.
Oh, thank you both. And thank you, Robert, for your question. Let me pause and see if anyone else has either reflections, questions on the data, additional questions to our speakers. Okay. Well, I want to start to wrap first by thanking all of our speakers. Thank you to Michaela and Tarabia and Ben and Joel for all being very engaging, for contributing to some great dialogue, and for some wonderful research and data over the course of the last few months. I want to also note that I want to offer appreciation to also Carmen and Absentia, as we noted earlier, and her contributions. The report is still forthcoming, and so that is something that I received a question in the chat privately about when the report is coming, and that is coming forth, and so you all will receive a copy in the future, both participants, and it'll go out to the field as a whole too, so you'll be able to hold it in your hands and look at it a little bit more closely. So later today, you will receive a link to a brief evaluation of today's session, and we really encourage you to take a few minutes to complete it. Your input is really invaluable for planning these activities. So once you receive that link, we do encourage you to fill out the survey. We do take this input seriously, and we use it to continuously improve the work that we're doing in these types of webinars. We all look forward to continuing this journey and learning from and with all of you. The recording of this webinar will be posted to the InDEEP website within a few days, and we really want to thank you all for your participation today and taking the time out. Thanks again to our speakers and to all of you for being here today. We want to wish you a great rest of your day.